All right, let's just jump right into this explainer and completely demystify the absolute foundation of all research. Today, we're figuring out the two completely distinct lenses we use to capture, measure, and analyze this messy, complex real world we live in. If you're gearing up for a brand new project, you're inevitably going to hit this massive wall. How do you actually capture human behaviors, systems, and truths, right? Like, do you count them or do you sit down and listen to them? So, here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with an introduction to our two lenses framework, take some deep dives into both qualitative and quantitative data, and then wrap up with a little showdown to help you pick the perfect method for your next study. Welcome to data collection. Let's quickly lay the groundwork for how we organize all this research data. Honestly, the best way to think about data collection is like putting on one of two pairs of glasses. One pair, the qualitative lens, lets us deeply understand the rich story and context of a situation. The other pair, the quantitative lens, lets us precisely measure the scale of it. You literally can't wear both at the exact same time, but knowing the difference between them, that's your golden ticket to unlocking pretty much any research problem. Qualitative data, the story. Let's try looking through that lens of meaning first. Simply put, qualitative data is all about words, descriptions, narratives, and images, right? Forget the numbers for a second. It is all about open-ended discovery. This is how we capture the genuine, lived human experience, getting right to the heart of the how and the why behind what people actually do. Now, one of the most fascinating characteristics of qualitative data is its flexibility. Instead of trying to shove people into rigid little boxes, it thrives on adapting to the environment. It's highly subjective and very context-dependent. Like, imagine an interviewer studying workload, and they unexpectedly find out that an open office plan is causing major stress and headaches for employees. Well, they don't have to just ignore that because it wasn't on their initial survey. Because the process is so flexible, they can immediately pivot and adapt their questions to follow that brand new thread. And this is exactly why qualitative data is just so incredibly rich. Think about this classroom observation. A simple, numerical count of raised hands completely misses the emotional withdrawal, the shifting body language, and the entire contextual dynamic happening in that room. Qualitative data actually preserves the messiness and depth of real life. So, to get all this rich information, researchers use highly interactive collection methods. Instead of blasting out a generic survey to thousands of people, a researcher might use in-depth interviews, focusing deeply on a really small sample, maybe just 5 to 10 grieving widows over a few months, to truly, authentically understand the complex, nonlinear process of loss. Moving on to qualitative pros and cons. Because, as you might guess, these powerful strengths bring some equally heavy trade-offs. Let's weigh this out. On the advantages side, qualitative data is an absolute powerhouse for revealing the why. For instance, discovering through interviews that students in Nepalganj drop out of school because of incredibly complex family illnesses, rather than just ticking some broad financial problems box. But look at those disadvantages. Because you only talk to a small handful of students, those findings absolutely cannot be statistically generalized to the entire country. And since the researcher is the one interpreting these stories, the data is naturally subject to their own personal biases. Which brings us to a crucial point. It is ridiculously labor-intensive. Think about this. A single small-scale qualitative study of just 20 interviews can eat up 300 to 400 hours. Seriously, just for a researcher to transcribe the audio, code the text, and analyze the themes. It's a massive investment for a pretty small sample size. Quantitative data, the numbers. Okay, let's entirely swap our glasses now and dive into the lens of measurement. Unlike our focus on individual, messy stories from a moment ago, quantitative data has one major goal: answering how many, how much, and how often with absolute cold objectivity. We're talking about information that can be counted, measured, and put through rigorous mathematical analysis. And those goals totally shape the core characteristics of quantitative research. It is completely objective and standardized. By using fixed collection methods, your classic surveys, questionnaires, and standardized tests, every single participant gets the exact same instrument. Because of that strict standardization, researchers can cleanly measure things like a 100-meter sprint time or a specific resting heart rate, entirely free from their own subjective interpretations. You're testing specific hypotheses here, not just exploring open-ended ideas. And this lets us do something kind of magical: generalize to massive populations.
Because the data is numerical and standardized, we can take a randomly selected sample of, say, 2,000 voters and legitimately use statistics to predict the behavior of 50 million people, complete with a highly quantifiable margin of error. It's amazing.
Quantitative pros and cons. Let's take a look at the specific advantages and limitations of strictly playing the numbers game. Make no mistake, quantitative data comes with some absolute superpowers. It is the undisputed gold standard for testing causal hypotheses, like scientifically proving whether a new drug actually causes a drop in blood pressure under strict, controlled conditions. It's totally objective, and it's incredibly efficient for analyzing giant datasets. But its rigid, standardized nature means it literally cannot adapt to unexpected realities mid-study. It can be dangerously reductionist.
And here's a perfect example of that reductionist flaw. An average patient satisfaction score of 4.2 out of 5? Well, that looks fantastic on a bar chart in some boardroom, but it is totally oversimplified. That one number completely masks the actual human context. Did that patient rate a 5 because they felt deeply, truly cared for by a compassionate nurse? Or did they rate a 5 just because they felt super pressured by an administrator standing right there with a clipboard?
Furthermore, these quantitative instruments can entirely miss the truth if the researcher just didn't anticipate it beforehand. Imagine you have a pre-written survey assuming teens don't exercise because of screen time. You ask them hours of questions about phones and TVs, but you completely miss the real, unlisted reason, like a highly dangerous traffic intersection blocking their path to the local park. Because traffic wasn't an option on your rigid survey, it simply doesn't exist in your data. Choosing your research lens. Now that we've deeply explored both of these methodologies, let's put them head-to-head. So, to summarize the core differences for you, qualitative data gives you that deeply human story, capturing subjective meaning from a small group through open-ended discovery. Quantitative data, on the other hand, gives you the statistical scale, offering objective measurement and rigorous hypothesis testing across massive populations. They are entirely different tools built for entirely different jobs. But here is the absolute crucial takeaway. You don't have to just pick one forever. In fact, the most groundbreaking research out there usually requires using both lenses together. You explore qualitatively first to discover the right questions to even ask, and then you measure quantitatively second to prove them at scale. So as you look at your next big question about the human experience, which lens are you going to reach for first?